So it's a longer reading today, just because there's a lot in the story that I didn't want us to sort of miss. If you take it sort of passage by passage, you kind of miss the thrust of what's going on. But there is just a wonderful, rich narrative in here. And as I've heard this talked about in the past, people will say, "Oh, just don't be fearful." And I go, "Well, maybe. I think it's a bit easier said than done. What else is going on here?" I don't know, do you ever look back and wonder why people did that, or why did they think like that? A couple of photos made the rounds on our family WhatsApp group over the last few weeks, and my children were amazed, like, "Did you really wear that?" And I was like, "Don't worry, it was a thing at the time." And Corey went, "You had hair. Why don't you grow it back?" I just went, "Darling, I'm really trying. This is the best I've managed." I said to the boys, "Enjoy the hair while you have it, chaps, okay? The genes are not good." What were people thinking? We smile and believe people who believed, when Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile. People said, "Oh, if anyone runs under 4 minutes for the mile, the body will just break up. The human body won't be able to." That was the narrative of the day by intelligent scientists. People who were clever and thoughtful that thought the world was flat for a long time. Some of you may remember the hysteria around the millennium bug that was going to destroy the world and destroy all our computers. And we look back and go, what were they thinking? And it's way too easy to look back and laugh and scoff, not necessarily because we're wiser, but because we stand on the other side of history. We sort of know how the story ended. But the uncomfortable truth, I think, is that people will look back on us in exactly the same way. They will wonder what assumptions we held so tightly that we couldn't imagine another possibility. A friend of mine was the director at Nokia, the mobile company. And he said, "I remember sitting in the boardroom the day we first got our hands on the new iPhone. And we looked at it and we scoffed and we laughed. And we went, who would want one of these? Why would you want to touch a screen? If you drop it, it breaks. Well, look at our brick. Can't break this. Who is ever going to want a phone that has a computer system on it? How ridiculous." Imagination shapes how we hold the moment before us. I think this story that we've heard today is a story about imagination. The spies all saw the same land. They agreed on the facts. They saw the land was good, that the cities were fortified, the people were strong. The difference wasn't what they saw, but how they imagined the future. And today I want to talk a little bit about what I call holy imagination. And by that I mean sort of the capacity of a community to interpret its present reality through God's future rather than its present limitations. So how can we interpret what's coming through God's future rather than our limitations? Before we jump into that, just a quick recap. This is where we are in the story, for those of you who might got lost. God's people have spent around 400 years in slavery. Generation after generation has cried out until God raises up Moses and raises a leader, takes them. There's a promise. They're going to be taken into a land flowing with milk and honey. And what follows is one of the greatest rescue stories in history. This was the story that would be a paradigm for the rest of God's people throughout history. God breaks Pharaoh's grip on his people. He parts the Red Sea, leads them through, destroys the army behind them, and provides manna and quail for them and water. And we fast forward about 18 months to 2 years. Israel's no longer enslaved. They're no longer trapped in Egypt. They've seen miracle after miracle and experienced God's faithfulness at every stage. And now they stand on the verge of the promised land. This is the moment that everything's been leading towards for this people. Now some of you, if you know the story, you might be thinking, hang on, I thought they travelled for 40 years, not 2 years. You're right. And this is the spoiler. They don't cross. They don't cross in this moment. They don't go into the promised land. This is one of the moments in the story that defines their history, because what happens next doesn't simply delay them by a few weeks. It changes the course of an entire generation. And instead of stepping into the future God had for them, they're going to spend another 38 years annoying each other, wandering through the wilderness. So what happened? How could a people who'd seen so much of God's faithfulness stand on the threshold of his promise and still fail to enter? The moment they find themselves in is extraordinary. This is all they've dreamed of. It's been the cry of their heart. And yet when the moment comes, they don't go in. So what do we notice? First, I just want to offer this. The lens through which we see the world changes everything. The lens through which we view the world changes everything. I was reading a fascinating article this week about the Royal Mail, the postal service in the UK. And over a number of years, they have invested hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds to improve their service. They've upgraded logistics, improved the sorting system, poured huge amounts of money into getting more first-class mail delivered the next day. The strange thing was, customer satisfaction didn't change. Not a single metric showed that people were happier with the service. And they couldn't work it out. Their service had objectively improved, yet people didn't seem to think any different about the Royal Mail. And eventually some bright spark said, well, why don't we ask a different question? And he asked this: do people like their postie? Do people like their postie? And it turned out that satisfaction around the mail service relied simply on this: do you know your postie or not? If there was a smile, a name, a relationship, their opinion of Royal Mail was dramatically more positive. And if they didn't know them, they didn't care. It didn't matter how good the service was, they didn't know them. They were indifferent or negative about it. The facts hadn't changed. Royal Mail wasn't suddenly delivering every letter on time. The service wasn't perfect for many of these people. The statistics hadn't dramatically improved, but where people knew their postie, they thought it was a good service. What changed was the lens through which people interpreted exactly the same experience. If I was on their advisory committee, I would be saying, guys, don't spend billions trying to improve your service. Just send your team on a course on how to be nice to people, and you'll get a much better impact. The lens through which people interpreted the same experience has changed. And this is what's happening in this story. The facts don't change. The land is still fertile. The cities are fortified. The descendants are out there. It seems like there's some massive people there. Joshua and Caleb don't come back with a different report. It's not like they went to a different part and saw something completely different. They saw the same thing. The difference wasn't the evidence, it was the lens they viewed it through. The 10 spies interpreted the land through the lens of the giants. Joshua and Caleb interpreted the giants through the lens of the God they already knew. And it's a fundamentally different way of thinking about it. But if I'm honest, these 10 spies have taken a bit of a beating throughout church history, and there's a part of me that sort of wants to defend them. Because what they say is absolutely true. These people are powerful. Yeah, I think they're right. They are powerful. These cities are fortified. Too right, they're fortified. We are weaker than they are. Probably true. And they were definitely big. If I tell you that I was going to jump off a big roof today, and someone said, Chris, that's a terrible idea. It's such a long way down and the ground is really hard, I'm not going to accuse you of lacking faith. I'm not going to come to you, you're so stupid. Why are you saying those sorts of things? You're simply making a sensible observation. The spies weren't stupid and they weren't dishonest. And they weren't even irrational. Their assessment was accurate. The problem was that it wasn't complete. They counted the giants, they measured the walls, they assessed the armies, but they forgot to count God in all of their thinking. Joshua and Caleb, they don't deny the facts. They don't pretend the giants aren't there. There are some Christian people you bump into them, they're really annoying, and they just act as though nothing ever goes wrong. Everything is perfect in their world, and they just sort of deny simple facts about what's going on. Joshua and Caleb aren't doing that. They simply refuse to believe that the facts are the whole story. Caleb says, we should go up and take possession of the land. And Joshua adds, if the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into the land. The 10 spies begin with the problem and wonder where God fits. Joshua and Caleb begin with God and reinterpret the problem. The circumstances are the same, the lens is completely different. Secondly, we see people led by fear and anxiety. If you look at many metrics around at the moment, a lot of people are sensing an increase in fear, in anxiety, in nervousness. If you're looking for a good read on this, Jonathan Haidt's book, An Anxious Generation, talks a lot about the rise in anxiety amongst parents particularly, but their children as well. But what happens next is one of the most fascinating parts of the story, because once the spies begin looking at the land through the wrong lens, it doesn't simply affect how they see the giants, it slowly begins to shape the whole story they tell themselves. See, this is the nature of anxiety. It doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't usually begin with a panic or despair. Most often it kind of starts with a perfectly reasonable observation. The people are powerful. The cities are fortified. And these statements are true. They're describing reality, but anxiety never leaves facts alone. And it begins to interpret them. So the conversation moves from, these people are powerful, to, we can't attack these people. And the facts become a conclusion. And then something even more subtle happens. The conclusions reshape their identity. Did you hear that bit when they said, we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them? It's a remarkable statement. Before the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Vegemites, whoever else was in there, say anything about them, before anyone else defines them, they've already defined themselves. Their circumstances have become so dominant, they now see themselves through the lens of fear. And their imagination is being captured by anxiety. And at the beginning of chapter 14, that anxiety is growing into something even bigger, and the people cry out, if only we died in Egypt. And you don't have to turn many pages back to realize how ridiculous that statement is. Or if only we died in the wilderness, why is this Lord bringing us to the land only to let us fall by the sword? And we see what's happened. The conversation began with the land, and now it's about God. Their understanding of God's being reshaped by the circumstances. One of my favourite writers, Edwin Friedman, don't buy his books, they're incredibly complicated. I read them and fall asleep, but I do like some of the points he makes. In fact, my favourite book of his is all about leadership. It's called The Failure of Nerve. The problem was he died halfway through writing it, and someone else tried to cobble it together at the end, and you can sort of tell. But if you can mine it well, there's some gold in there. And he talks about anxious systems, and anxious families, anxious organizations lose their capacity to imagine new possibilities. And instead of asking what might be possible, they become consumed by what might go wrong. And have you ever seen that with people where their first thought is, well, this could go wrong, and this could go wrong, and this could be a nightmare, and we go, maybe, but actually something beautiful could happen too. And they recycle the same fears, the same conversations, the same conclusions, until catastrophe feels inevitable. I wonder if we recognize some of those patterns, because anxiety can have a remarkable ability to become the narrator of our lives. It persuades us that preserving what we have is more important than pursuing what God wants for us. It tells us that failure is fatal, that risk is irresponsible, and that the safest option is always the wisest one. I was with some people this week, and they said, our aim is to make this place as safe as possible. I said, why? Why are you trying to make it as safe as necessary and then do the appropriate amount of risk around the edge? When we planted a church into Nairobi, people came up to us and said, I just want you to know I think you're absolutely stupid for doing this. Why are you planting a church in Nairobi? Why are you planting an evening church? People don't do evening church around here. That's what people think is a cult. Why are you not wearing a fancy suit? All pastors in Kenya wear a fancy suit. They won't think you're a proper church. We just felt called by God as we prayed about it to do something different. Because we weren't trying to reach those who were comfortable with church. We weren't trying to reach those who loved what was going on in every other church. We were trying to reach those who hated church and those who were struggling with it. And I knew we were getting somewhere on one day when this man turned up. He was a big man with a big suit on, if you know what I mean. And he had a waistcoat with a pocket watch. I don't know how many of you wear a pocket watch to church. It's quite in. And he had a top hat and a cane. He looked like he was going for a day at the races, not a day at church. And he looked at me and he just scoffed. He said, what are you doing? Why are you dressing like this for church? Look at you in your skinny jeans. I said, they're not skinny, I just have fat legs. And he said this is not how church is done. And he pointed to himself, he said, look, this is the cultural way we have of dressing for church. I said, that's not your cultural way of dressing for church. I said, that's my cultural way of dressing. This is a colonial hangover you have, my friend. And he looked at me and said, I've come here with one purpose. He said, I've come here to pull my daughter out of this church. She hates going to church, but I've noticed she's sneaking out in the evening to come along to your church, and it won't do. And he marched into our evening service, and he had one of those faces that had all the personality of a Rottweiler. At the end of the service, he walked up to me and said, I don't pretend to know what you are doing here, but I want you to know that God's Spirit is here. Thank you for providing a place where my daughter can meet God. And it was so easy, we could have so easily fallen into the pattern of fear and concern driving what we do rather than the animating Spirit of God. I was with someone this week, they applied for a job, they said, I felt God had told me I was going to get this job. I said, that's good. She said, but it was extraordinary. She said, I felt such conviction that I was going to have this job. And so I went away on retreat. I spent 5 days on retreat coming up with the plan that I was going to present to this board of directors. Presented this wonderful plan, and at the end I didn't get the job. I said, so what do you do? I said, well, I went back to my boyfriend at the time. I said, it's now my husband. I said, what? And he said, do you think God told you you're going to get a job? I said, absolutely, I've never heard God speak so clearly. He said, how convinced are you that God wanted you to have this job? I said, completely convinced. I said, you need to ring them up then. So she rang them up and said, I think God wants me to have this job. And she worked out who they'd hired, and she realised that the person they'd hired was an absolute rock star, was unbelievably good, way more qualified. So she got in touch with him and said, look, I see you got this job. I was down with the final 2 candidates with you. I'd love to come and learn. I'm happy to give up a day a week working for McKinsey. Can I come and work alongside you and offer what I've got? And he said, okay, let's try that. So she starts giving up a day a week. And after about 2 weeks, he said to her, what was your plan for taking this forward? And he said, this is the plan that I'd come up with. And it was completely different to the plan he'd suggested in the interview. But they looked at this together. And then the wife of the owner of the business came in and looked at it and said, who drew this? I had this in a dream 2 weeks ago. And she had exactly the same business plan. And it became the business plan they adopted. And she's now, 5 years later, she's now doing that job. Fear could have become the dominating narrative where she'd stepped away from everything that she felt. But if we feel that God has called us to, we go. We feel that God has called us to, we go. And it doesn't mean we do everything and we check it, and we might sometimes get it wrong, and we might sometimes just have had too much cheese the night before, and that's okay. But actually what we want to be saying is, if God says go, let's go. We begin, if we're not careful, noticing the wrong things. But there are things around us. We talk about decline in church attendance, limited finances, congregations that are shrinking, people disinterested about God or the culture around us. And they're real observations, but little by little, anxiety becomes the lens through which we interpret everything. And we see this everywhere. It's not just a church problem. It's everywhere in life. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, talks about the difference between one-way and two-way doors as a way of just framing some of this anxiety. He says some decisions are really one-way doors. When you go through them, there's no way back. He said most of them are two-way doors. So most of the things you go through, and if it goes wrong, we'll just go back. That's okay. They don't work, you can learn from them. You step back through the door and try something new. The problem is that when we're anxious, we treat every decision as though it's a one-way door, as though it's the only thing we can ever do. And once we've made that decision, it's the end of it. A few years ago, as I was talking with a church, they were on the brink of closing. They had 150 people for years, and they'd shrunk to about 15. They were calling people in, they called in the bishop and said, we want to close this church. I said, I can see why. See why you want to do that. But I want to ask a question. So you got $500,000 in the bank. What are you going to do with that? They said, well, we've earmarked that money to preserve this building as a museum for future generations. And he just went, maybe. So he asked him a different question. What if you took a tiny amount of that money? What if you just took a tiny little bit of it and said to the community around you, we'd love to throw the biggest breakfast ever for you, just to invite you in. Come and have breakfast in our tab, make it brilliant, make it beautiful, get everyone in, just see what happens. And immediately they would go, what if no one comes? What if nothing happens? What if we've wasted some money on a breakfast and no one comes to eat it? And he pushed back and said, well, okay, maybe that does happen. And what's the downside of that? You lose a couple of $1,000. You feel a bit disappointed. And then you try someone else. No one dies if we do this. The building's still there, the church exists, but the upside is something extraordinary might happen. So they decided to give it a go. Half the village turned up. People loved it. They thought it was the best thing. They said, would you do this again? And the church did, and over time it became part of their rhythm of worshipping. They now have 200 people turning up every Sunday to worship Jesus and have a cracking breakfast together. That's not a formula. Not every experiment works like that, but it's exactly the point. Faith doesn't require certainty before it acts. It just takes the next faithful step they feel God has put before them. And I wonder what that feels like for you and for me. What does that feel like for us as a community? Where anxiety might have been the driver, but actually we could just invite someone to Alpha. We can invite someone to have a coffee and to talk about them, get to know them. Perhaps it's offering to pray for someone. I don't know if you're noticing this, but for the first time, I think in my entire adult life, I feel like people are really open when I say, can I pray with you? It's really weird. And I'm here, it's not just, I don't think it's just me seeing this. The amount of Christians I'm talking to who are going, yeah, I just had an opportunity to pray with someone. I never thought that would happen. And it's not everywhere for sure, but it is there. Perhaps it's stepping into something new, even when you feel disqualified, feel like you're too old, or you're too young, or you're too inexperienced, or too ordinary. And you may be absolutely right about your limitations. The spies were right about the giants, but limitations are not the story. The tragedy of this story is not that Israel saw the giants. The tragedy is that they could no longer imagine a future in which God was bigger than the giants. We've got to remember that our future is bigger than the giants before us. Joshua and Caleb are not denying the facts. They don't minimize the challenge. They just refuse to let anxiety have the final word. And I think this is sort of what holy imagination comes down to. And perhaps that's why it matters. We've talked over the last few weeks about crossing over. What does it look like to be the kinds of people that can inhabit this new building, this new space, this new visibility in the community that we're walking into? Crossing over always requires a renewed imagination, becoming the kind of people who interpret the future not through the lens of fear, but through the character of God. And as we reflect on this, we're reminded none of us live by facts alone. We live by the stories we share, The stories we inhabit shape what we believe is possible, and they shape the questions we ask, the risk we're willing to take, and the way we respond to disappointment. One of the things I've noticed as I've worked with different organisations is that the healthiest cultures, the healthiest organisations, the healthiest churches are rarely the ones with the biggest budgets or the cleverest strategies. They're the ones who know which story they're living in. They keep coming back to it, they tell it, they celebrate it, they allow it to shape the way they understand things, every opportunity, every challenge. When Abby and I were planning to move here, and we were talking about what that would look like, we had a couple of close friends who I love dearly, who challenged us really strongly. And they said, what if it doesn't work? What if it doesn't work? What if it's worse than what you already have? What about if your kids don't fit in? What about if you don't fit in? What about if they keep beating you at cricket? Legitimate concerns that we have to hold before our Maker. These weren't foolish questions, they were sensible observations. But as we prayed about it, we prayed about this as a family, we realised something important. We didn't want the defining story of that decision to be fear. We wanted it to be God's leading. And we weren't pretending there were no risks. There definitely were. But we didn't want anxiety to become the narrator of our future. And by the way, that doesn't mean we found it easy. We didn't. When we got to, just seeing if my kids are here, when we got to Shanghai Airport, halfway between here, just literally had 8 hours in Shanghai, the kids fell asleep. Abby was asleep. And I sat on my own, and I sobbed. And I cried a little bit. I was like, God, I'm not really sure what you're up to. But I want to trust you in this moment, even though it just feels a bit silly. We weren't pretending there were no risks. But we sat there as a family, we prayed, we remembered bits of our story. When we planted our church in Tenerife, 6 weeks before we started, all of our funding for that church plant was pulled out. We were going to have a salary for 12 months while we got it established, and that got pulled. The church that we were planting out of got taken over by another vicar who said, I want nothing to do with church planting. We're not going to back you in any way, and no one's allowed to go from this church with you as you send you. It's really encouraging stuff that you're just looking for. So 6 of us and our dog sat on the veranda in Kenya, and we just said, God, what do you want us to do? And we just felt God still wanted us to go ahead, so we planted this church and went ahead. There was no money. We didn't have the support we felt we needed. And as we prayed, we felt God say, this will be a vision because you're meant to be a home for the homeless. The provision that we saw through the next years was extraordinary in ways I could barely describe it. We never knew week by week how we were going to survive and how we were going to put food on the table, but God kept showing up in amazing ways. We had just checks arrive on our doorstep. We turned up a few times and there were just bags of shopping on our veranda. One day someone rang up and said, I had this dream last night. We just dreamt that we were meant to pay for your car insurance. Do you know when it runs out? I was like, I do. It runs out tomorrow. We were on our way to pull our kids out of school because we couldn't afford the fees to have them in school there. And someone rang up and said, we just want to pay for your kids' school fees. It was just extraordinary how God kept showing up. Over the years, we saw incredible things in the church on the back of this. And rather professionally, humbly, none of it was about what I managed to do. But the stuff around it was amazing. People turned up who hadn't been in church in years. The worship music attracted people. They turned up for the kids' work. They turned up for social justice. The legal charity that we founded in Kenya is now 10 to 20 people who are innocent have been released from prison every month because of it. It's incredible to see what God did. And I'm not sharing this because we were superstars. We weren't. We really got so much wrong along the way. But we did manage to do, as we came here, we remembered this story. And that's why we share the story. And that's why it's so important for those of you who've been here a while to keep sharing the story. As new people come along and go, do you know what? We had no idea how we were going to get into this new building. We had no idea. I remember talking to Paul and Brad and some of you going, well, we need this amount of money and we've got about 10% of it. What do we do? We keep sharing these stories of God and how he steps in and how he does this thing. So we sat and pondered our future. We looked to moving here. It was the story of what God had done that convinced us. God, you've done it before. We trust that you will do it again. We feel that you're saying go. We need to go. Or as Wilbur said at the time, he said, this isn't the time to start making sensible decisions. So we just went. The Bible account about this story is, as we look at it, the story is the thing that governs us. The 10 spies allowed the giants to tell the story. Joshua and Caleb allowed God to tell the story. Joshua begins, if the Lord is pleased with us, if the Lord will delight in us, his confidence isn't in Israel's strength. Our confidence will never be in our strength and gifting, what we have, but our confidence will be in this is the God who we worship, and these are the things that he's done. And that's holy imagination. It's allowing God's character, God's promise, God's faithfulness to become the starting point from which we understand everything else. And this is why Scripture constantly calls us, that constantly echoes back to these stories to remember God's faithfulness. It's not wishful thinking. It's not pretending the giants out there. It's remembering who God is before deciding what is possible. And as we go into this new journey, I think that's what God might be calling in each one of us. Will we become a people whose imagination is shaped by scarcity and fear, and what seems sensible and realistic? Or are we a people who know the God's story? We know God's faithfulness and what he's done, and let that shape what we'll do in the future.